Hello and welcome to Undivided. I'm Brandi Kruse. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback. Just over a week left until Election Day, so we're going to talk about a lot of election-related issues today. I will tell you, I got a lot to say on today's episode. A few things angering me. We're going to follow up from some stories on Friday. Also, we'll get to the fact that Washington State's Senate race, now in a statistical tie, real clear politics, labeling it a toss-up between Republican challenger Tiffany Smiley and 30-year incumbent Democrat Senator Patty Murray. So we'll discuss how the race got to this point and whether Tiffany Smiley truly has a chance of winning. Also, a bizarre post from Planned Parenthood seems to back up what I had previously thought was sort of an extreme narrative from the right when it comes to abortion. And so we're going to talk about this Planned Parenthood post and the fact that it's just bizarre. Also, we'll get to some viewer comments on the U.S. Senate race, and I'm going to talk about a follow-up to a story we discussed last week about a bunch of ballots being tossed in some bushes. I followed up with the Secretary of State's office and the local elections office where those ballots were found. I'll tell you what they had to say. But first, some new news on the attack on Paul Pelosi at his home in San Francisco. Of course, Paul Pelosi, the husband of the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi. I went on, we'll call it a rant, I guess. I had a lecture for some of you on the Friday show about this jump to assume that this was some sort of conspiracy, some effort from Democrats to get sympathy ahead of the election, Paul Pelosi's gay lover that he got into a quarrel with. And my general message on Friday was that you wouldn't be approaching this story in the same way if it was the spouse of a Republican politician. I mean, I just don't, I don't believe that for a second, that you'd have folks saying, oh no, let's wait for more details, or oh, it's this person's gay lover. And so, you know, it bothers me when our reaction to an 82-year-old being beat with a hammer is automatically political and automatically skeptical, as opposed to having sympathy. And yeah, fine, we want to wait for more information, that's fine. But to throw out all these crazy conspiracies, well, you know, when we should just have sympathy for this 82-year-old man and not blow it into some political fiasco, it just speaks to the state of the country. And now we're getting more details that I hope can put some of these conspiracies to rest. And, you know, there's some witness statements in this that seem to back some of this up, but this is in the criminal complaint, the federal criminal complaint in this case. And again, this guy, look, David Wayne DePape, he's clearly mentally unstable. And I think that's the case for most of these people who resort to targeting politicians for acts of political violence. Like, you're not well. Normal functioning adults take out their political disagreements in other ways. So a couple things. It becomes pretty clear in this affidavit that DePape broke into the Pelosi residence, that he wasn't there with Paul Pelosi in the middle of the night. A private security guard who was working nearby heard this sort of break-in happening. So it says, I'm going to read part of this for you. San Francisco Police Department recovered zip ties in Pelosi's bedroom and in the hallway near the front door of the Pelosi residence. In addition, law enforcement searched DePape's backpack at the Pelosi residence, and they found, among other things, a roll of tape, white rope, one hammer, one pair of rubber and cloth gloves, and a journal. Then they go on to detail their interview with DePape that was conducted by San Francisco Police Department officers after he was Mirandized. It says DePape stated that he was going to hold Nancy hostage and talk to her. If Nancy were to tell DePape the truth, he would let her go, and if she lied, he was going to break her kneecaps. DePape was certain that Nancy would not have told the truth. In the course of the interview, DePape articulated he viewed Nancy as the, quote, leader of the pack of lies told by the Democratic Party. DePape also later explained that by breaking Nancy's kneecaps, she would then have to be wheeled into Congress, which would show other members of Congress there were consequences to actions. Again, this is like a madman we're talking about here. DePape also explained generally that he wanted to use Nancy to lure another individual to DePape. Not sure who that is. DePape stated that he broke into the house through a glass door, which was a difficult task that required the use of a hammer. DePape stated that Pelosi was in bed and appeared, Paul Pelosi, surprised by DePape. DePape told Pelosi to wake up. He told Pelosi that he was looking for Nancy. Pelosi responded that she was not present. Pelosi asked how they could resolve the situation and what DePape wanted to do. DePape stated he wanted to tie Pelosi up so that DePape could go to sleep as he was tired from having had to carry a backpack to Pelosi's residence. Around this time, according to DePape started taking out twist ties from his pocket so he could restrain Pelosi. Pelosi moved toward another part of the house, but DePape stopped him, and together they went into a back bedroom. While talking with each other, Pelosi went into a bathroom where he grabbed a phone to call 911. DePape stated he felt like Pelosi's actions compelled him to respond. DePape remembered thinking that there was no way the police were going to forget about the phone call. DePape explained that he did not leave after Pelosi's call to 911 because, much like the American founding fathers with the British, he was fighting against tyranny without the option of surrender. So look, there is no reason to continue the conspiracies on this or to have that be your default reaction. This was an insane guy. I don't even know if he's a Republican. He's just a crazy person who broke into the Speaker of the House's home, which you'd think that would not be possible in today's day and age, given, I'm sure, the number of threats against her. I hope that they beef up security moving forward. So this is horrifying. I mean, those details are horrifying. This is obviously a dangerous person. I'm glad he's in custody. I'm glad Paul Pelosi's alive. But that's the extent of, I'm not going to lecture you anymore on my frustrations over the Paul Pelosi's gay lover narrative. Now, all that being said, I want to talk about how this attack on Paul Pelosi is being leveraged for political purposes in the final weeks of a campaign. And make no mistake, that's what's happening here. There was an opinion piece in the Washington Post, and the headline is, "Don't blame both sides. The right is driving political violence." And in it, the author, Max Boot, writes, "Violence is unacceptable, whether from the left or right, period. But we can't allow GOP leaders to get away with this false moral equivalency. They are evading their responsibility for their extremist rhetoric that all too often motivates extremist actions." They are evading their responsibility for their extremist rhetoric that all too often motivates extremist actions. To suggest with any level of seriousness that the right is in a league of its own when it comes to political violence is not only deeply dishonest, but it perpetuates the exact behavior you claim to be so disgusted by. Yes, the right wing is guilty of acts of political violence in this country. January 6th was a national embarrassment, and what happened to Paul Pelosi is horrific. And that's why Republicans in positions of power said so this week unequivocally. When it comes to political violence and condemning political violence, the left should be very careful in claiming the moral high ground. It wasn't the far right that set cities on fire in 2020. It wasn't the far right that took over 6 blocks in Seattle and created an environment so dangerous that people were shot, some of them fatally. It wasn't the far right that firebombed a police union or tried to light a police precinct on fire with officers inside. It wasn't the far right that mobbed my news crew at CHOP, forcing us to seek refuge in a fire station. It wasn't the far right that lit police cruisers on fire and stole the rifles inside of them. It wasn't a far-right politician who openly celebrated acts of violence, vandalism, and arson. No, that was a police abolitionist who was nearly elected in Seattle because the far left didn't mind her obvious and dangerous propensity for extremism. And it wasn't the far-right media that had this to say when Senator Rand Paul had 6 of his ribs broken.
Details today on the incident that left Senator Rand Paul with 6 broken ribs. This might be one of my favorite stories.
The mainstream media and Democratic politicians were all but silent on every single story I just mentioned. And when they did talk about it, they were either condoning it or making excuses for it. You'll all recall the CNN headline calling riots in Kenosha, Wisconsin, fiery but mostly peaceful as a city burned. So don't tell me that the far right is in a league of its own when it comes to political violence. And don't tell me that the left has some sort of moral high ground when it comes to condemning political violence. This isn't a contest, and nothing will change until you stop treating it like one. Excuse my language, I'll bleep that one out. I want to talk about the issue of abortion, which continues to be, I hear from some people saying, why are you focusing so much on abortion? It's because there are only so many issues that are true swing voter issues that truly have the power to sway undecided voters. And I think abortion this time around is one of them. And that's why you see it so often in Democratic ads trying to paint their opponents as extremists. And more and more, you're starting to see Republicans trying to paint Democrats as extreme on the issue of abortion, saying, hey, this person, supports abortion all the way up to the point of birth. In swing races, this has become a common theme, and particularly in Washington's 8th congressional district, which we've talked about a lot. Congresswoman Kim Schreier is the Democratic incumbent, and she is facing Republican Matt Larkin, who's very conservative, more so than her previous challengers for that particular seat. So the two of them had a debate, and obviously the issue of abortion came up. A lot of the ads center around abortion. And there was this really interesting exchange that I wanted to play for you.
If you were to help draft a federal ban on abortion, what exceptions or limits would you want to include?
Look, this is a deeply personal topic. I understand the emotion behind it on both sides of the aisle. I do. I completely understand why you could be passionately pro-choice. I do. And I understand the logic of someone who's passionately pro-life. We need to be affirming and defending life in this country as much as possible. But let me be clear, nothing is changing in Washington state. Women are not losing access to safe and legal abortions, nor will they. The court has ruled this is a state's issue, and I'm extremely happy with it being at the state level. I'm not planning on going back to D.C. and pushing for a federal abortion ban. That's not in my topic playbook. I've got other things to worry about. The destroyed economy, the reckless spending, the energy prices, the food prices, the gas prices. These are things I'm going to be focusing on in Washington, D.C.
Congresswoman Schreier, response?
When the Supreme Court overturned Roe, that was a devastating decision. It was a gut punch for American women who have had the right to a safe, legal abortion for 50 years. And now girls have fewer rights than their mothers or their grandmothers. And what we're seeing across the country is legislatures taking away the right to an abortion, banning it in some cases from the moment of conception and with no exceptions for rape or incest. And although my opponent states differently now that he is in a general election, that is exactly what he supports. And you already noted that he has said with no exceptions for rape or incest. It's outrageous, it's extreme, it's out of touch, and I want to be clear that such a ban would affect us here in Washington state, that a national ban would override the protections we have in Washington state. Don't be fooled, it's an extreme and dangerous agenda.
And we want to stay with you, Congresswoman Schreier. You support a federal law to protect the right to abortion, as you have stated. Should any exceptions be written into law that protects the right to abortion?
This is a healthcare decision that needs to be made by a woman and her doctor, not the government.
Response, Mr. Larkin?
Yeah, we know her position on that. She's voted twice and co-sponsored a bill allowing for abortions up until the moment of delivery, for any reason whatsoever, federally funded. What that means is gender selection could be a reason. That means if you're a minute from having a baby and it's a girl and you wanted a boy, you can terminate that baby's life minutes before delivery. That's an extreme position. That's extreme to 90% of the American public. So I'm not the extreme one in my position here.
Please keep it down.
Congresswoman Schreier?
Yeah, Mr. Larkin is making things up and talking about things that no woman or doctor would do in order to hide his own extreme position on this, which is banning abortion entirely with no exceptions, in his own words, for rape or incest or things like that. That is extreme, it's dangerous, a national ban would override our protections here, and he is just trying to deflect with, frankly, insulting comments.
So what you see there is Matt Larkin trying to, again, turn the tables on Kim Schreier, saying, you're calling me an extremist, but you don't support any restrictions on abortion. And he gives that example.
That means if you're a minute from having a baby and it's a girl and you wanted a boy, you can terminate that baby's life minutes before delivery. That's an extreme position. That's extreme to 90% of the American public.
Now, when I saw that, I kind of had the same reaction as the folks who were in the room for the debate. I was like, okay, nobody's doing that. Nobody is waiting to get up to the moment in the delivery room, and then they're like, oh, it's a boy, I don't want it, terminate the pregnancy. That's just not happening. And so in that sense, I was like, all right, let's use a more realistic example of that, right? But then, oh my gosh, Planned Parenthood. Who is manning Planned Parenthood's Twitter? Because they sent out the most tone-deaf tweet about abortion access that almost goes to kind of prove the point that Matt Larkin was making. And I think it's just ill-timed for Planned Parenthood because, again, you have these Republicans out there who are trying to paint Democrats as extremists, which in some cases I think is unfair when you use that example that Matt Larkin used. But Planned Parenthood is out here just sort of proving his point. So they sent out a tweet saying, any reason to get an abortion is the right reason. Any reason to get an abortion is the right reason. And my response to that was, is it though? That is not a position that the majority of Americans hold, that any reason to get an abortion is the right reason. And to make the tweet even worse, they sent out this graphic with it. And it says, everyone loves someone who had an abortion. So they're trying to make the issue relatable. Like, you know someone in your life, you love someone who's probably had an abortion. But the font that they chose was like, you know those blocks that kids play with that have words or have letters on them? That's the font that they used. So, and it's like in these, you know, kids' colors like baby blue and pink. And it's like, okay, so you're using like blocks that children play with to justify abortion. The whole thing was honestly horrifying. And I've said I'm pro-choice. I am fine with Washington state's law as it exists. And even I looked at that, I was like, wow, that is in horrible taste. And we read viewer comments on the show every Monday. And so I wanted to read viewer comments to this Planned Parenthood tweet because I posted it on my social media pages. Connie says, it is a heartbreaking subject and their PR firm is distasteful. And I agree with that. No matter where you sit on this issue, you know, abortion, Democrats are saying, you know, it should be safe, but it should be rare. And we want to try to, when we can, prevent women from needing abortions. And this goes against that entirely. Some people, Ian said, I can't fathom how this is a positive advertisement. Tracy said, I thought this was a joke, not a very funny one, but still a joke. Was not a joke. It was from the official Planned Parenthood account. Kayleen said, not surprising at all. They have absolutely no self-awareness. Julie, this represents such a deficit of morality. Darlene said, I couldn't imagine any deeper depravity. And so, you know, you're going to look at that differently whether you support abortion rights or you are pro-life. But when I look at that, I just can't think of, you know, down the finish line with abortion, such a key issue. This is such an extreme position to take. This is a really fringe position to take, just as much as it is, I think, to support an abortion ban with no exceptions for rape and incest. I see that as an extreme position. That's my personal opinion. And this is just as extreme to say any reason to get an abortion is the right reason. No, any reason to get an abortion is not the right reason. Like a lot of people were saying, what if someone's pressured by their partner to get an abortion? Is that the right reason? So there are a lot of wrong reasons to get an abortion. And I think most reasonable people would agree with that. So Planned Parenthood, I don't know who came up with that tweet. I don't know if that's really the sentiment that people on the left hold, but this is not the way that we should be discussing the topic of abortion. So I'm sure some of you saw the big campaign news over the weekend. In Washington state, Real Clear Politics now calls the Senate race here a toss-up, which is extraordinary. And I have said, and I brought hold on. We happen to have, I think this is a crow. If you're watching on the video podcast, I'm pretty sure this is a crow. It's a little, we already had it in the studio. I may be eating crow. I won't eat you, little friend, because you're plastic and that would hurt. But I may have to eat crow on the Tiffany Smiley race. I know now somebody's going to tell me this isn't a crow. What else could it be? Anyway, you can just sit right here, buddy, just for this segment. Okay. I may have to eat crow on this race because I've said from the beginning that I thought it was totally uphill battle. I thought she would have been better served to wait 2 years and run against our other senator, Senator Maria Cantwell, who I think is far less popular among Democrats than Patty Murray. And so I was sort of like, gosh, why did Tiffany Smiley choose to run against Patty Murray in a race that was almost impossible to win? And I've said that repeatedly. And then I saw this out from Real Clear Politics, and Real Clear Politics is nonpartisan. So now they have 7 seats in the Senate labeled a toss-up, which very much puts Republicans in the realm of being able to control the Senate. So now Washington becomes a toss-up along with Nevada, Arizona, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Georgia, and New Hampshire. And this is just shocking to me. So basically what Real Clear Politics does is it looks at available polling that they deem is reliable, and it will set races based on that. And now the latest poll out in this race has them within a statistical tie, so within the margin of error, with only 2.9% of voters undecided, which in a race that close, 2.9% undecided can be the difference for Patty Murray or for Tiffany Smiley. So Tiffany Smiley's campaign obviously celebrating this. I will say after I saw it, I felt a little silly for a question I asked Iowa Senator Joni Ernst last week. Remember, we did a sit down with Tiffany Smiley, and Senator Ernst was in town from Iowa as a campaign surrogate. And I I asked, and I'll play the clip, Senator Ernst, why are you here? There are races that are more close than this one. There are Senate races that are, according to polling, closer than this one. Your seatmate Chuck Grassley is one of them. I think there's been some polls that have that race within 3 points. So if we're looking at polling, is your time better spent elsewhere if we're to believe that Tiffany's maybe 8 points behind?
I actually don't believe a lot of the polls out there. If you had looked at the poll done 2 years ago on my own race, I would have been losing in that poll. But I won by nearly 8 points. So I have very little confidence in some of the polls. And I do think with the type of leadership that Tiffany is bringing to the state of Washington and voters' reactions to her, they really want someone who's working for Washington, and we have not seen that from Patty Murray.
So this is a pretty remarkable place for Tiffany Smiley to be, especially since you did have just a week ago polls putting her about 8 points behind. Again, I've been really skeptical of political polling since 2016, since Donald Trump won the presidency. And I remember being at the Republican election night party, and I think it was CNN they had on, where it said Donald Trump had a 1% chance of winning the presidency. And ever since then, polls have just meant a lot less to me. But when I look at Tiffany Smiley and where she's at, the polls have shown since she entered the race a slow and steady narrowing of the deficit. And so I guess when I look at that and just sort of how consistent it's been in her slowly making up ground against Patty Murray, I do think that this is going to be a close one. We will see what happens on election night. But I've said that I made the promise on Twitter when I sent out this Real Clear Politics poll. I said that and I'll tell you guys this too, so you can hold me to it. If Tiffany Smiley wins, I will personally create a montage of all the times I said she'd probably lose, and I'll pin it to my profile page on Twitter for a full month. So I'm happy to eat crow if Tiffany Smiley loses. Talking heads, we're not perfect, we make mistakes, but I'll tell you, it will be extraordinary if a Republican wins a Senate seat in Washington state. And also down in Oregon with the Republican candidate for governor. I mean, right now as it sits, there are no statewide elected Republicans on the entire West Coast. The last one was our Secretary of State, Kim Wyman, who left for a job in the Biden administration, and she was the last one on the entire West Coast. And so if we have an election now where you've got a Republican senator in Washington state who wins and a Republican governor in Oregon, of all places, then I think that that's very telling about how dissatisfied voters on the West Coast are with the state of things around, the cost of gasoline. It's highest on the West Coast in California, Oregon, and Washington. The just being overtaxed and overburdened, the crime problem, the drug crisis, the homelessness crisis, I think will show that people are really at their wits' end with those issues and willing to elect Republicans to try to fix it. Coming up in a few minutes, we'll end the show by hearing some of your thoughts on the state of the Washington Senate race and the characterization that it is a toss-up now between Patty Murray and Tiffany Smiley. I'm also going to end the show with some thoughts and reflections on a very important milestone. So in case you forgot, today's a really important day. Yes, it's Halloween, but it's also the end of Governor Jay Inslee's state of emergency around COVID. So I'm going to have some thoughts and considerations for our elected leaders about the nearly 1,000 days we spent under one-man rule in Washington. But before that, I promised you I'd follow up on this story that was reported in the West Seattle blog about a guy finding 9 ballots just dumped in some bushes in West Seattle. One of the things that I've been very clear about is that I don't think elections are perfect. I think there are opportunities for fraud. There are always improvements in the system. I don't believe the 2020 election was stolen. But one of the things I wish the media would do and elections officials is jump on all these individual stories that are cause for concern, because it shows that, hey, we know that elections aren't perfect and we're not going to pretend that they are. And when there are instances of fraud or wrongdoing, the people in charge are going to hold those individuals accountable. And so I just wanted to reach out to the King County Elections Office and to the Secretary of State's office about these 9 ballots and kind of get some information about, okay, what happens in an instance like this? So we'll start with the response I got from the Director of External Affairs for the Office of Secretary of State. And they responded very promptly because I had reached out and just said, hey, have you heard about this? Would the Secretary of State's office be involved with investigations into incidents like this? And is there a state law making it illegal? Because I did find one state law that has to do with ballot tampering when a ballot is completed, but these ballots were still in their original envelopes, and so they were blank. They hadn't been filled out. So what the Secretary of State's office told me is incidents of mail theft or discovery of stolen mail should be reported immediately to local police, where the reporting person should get a report number and send it to the Postal Inspection Service. So it sounds like they think this is an incident of stolen mail, and that if somebody finds it, so if you're to find a ballot that should have been in someone's mailbox and it isn't, that you should file a police report, get a report number, and report it to the postal inspector. They also said the county elections department can provide replacement ballots, and the county elections manager should report the incident to the postal inspector and the Secretary of State's Elections Division for tracking. So I also reached out to, like I said, the King County Elections Office. This was an incident in King County. Their chief of staff for King County Elections, Kendall Hodson, responded to me and said, we've heard from a few folks about this incident. And we totally understand that it's alarming to see ballots in bushes. Yeah, it's a little alarming. She went on to say, interestingly, this comes up almost every election cycle because sadly mail theft isn't uncommon, and this is almost always a mail theft issue, not something specifically related to ballots. So maybe they steal a bunch of mail because all these ballots were from the same block, so maybe were stolen from one of those collective kind of mail things. Our guidance is always first to contact local law enforcement about the theft and then reach out to us at King County Elections so we can get people replacement ballots. She also says, what's also important to know is we'll only ever count 1 ballot per voter. That's what she says. So if someone did try to fraudulently vote a ballot they found in a ditch, we would identify that when our team verifies the voter's signature. Now, that being said, one of the challenges there is, let's say that somebody never got their ballot because it was put in a bush, and then somebody found that and filled out the ballots and sent it in, and the original voter never contacted anyone, etc. You might think that that's their vote, but that's why laws exist, right? And what she points out is that if we believed there was a case of attempted fraud, we would refer that case to the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. And that's what I always think people have to remember too, is that there are opportunities for fraud. 9 ballots in a bush, that's 9 opportunities for fraud. But fraud is also against the law. Ballot fraud, election fraud is against the law. So there are a lot of crimes that people can commit, that they have opportunities to commit. I mean, you and I could go out and commit crimes today, but we ultimately would have to deal with the possible consequences of doing so. And so in theory, laws against voting fraud should act as a deterrent for people not to take advantage of opportunities for voting fraud when they're presented to them. But anyway, so it's good to know that a couple people have already talked to the King County Elections Office about these 9 discarded ballots. It sounds like there was an effort to get new ballots to the voters as well, so their votes can count. And, you know, there are going to be one-off incidents like this, and it needs to be taken seriously. I think that's what helps build trust in our election process. And if you believe that your ballot has got lost, it never came to you, you need to report that. Whether you intended to vote or not, you need to report it so that they know if somebody sends that ballot in that it did not come from you. The following segment is presented in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. I want to take a moment to recognize that today is the end of the state of emergency in Washington around COVID-19. I know some of you might be wondering, we have still been in a state of emergency. Yes, we have been in a state of emergency around COVID-19 for 975 days. And during that 975 days, Governor Jay Inslee has had near unilateral power to respond to the pandemic as he sees fit. And as you know, he made decisions that had a profound impact on people's lives over the past 2+ years. There were efforts among Republican lawmakers in Olympia and even a few moderate Democrats to try to put checks and balances on the governor's emergency power to, after a certain period of time, make it so that lawmakers in Olympia would have to sign off on whether a state of emergency would be allowed to continue. The idea being that our system of government wasn't really designed for one person to have such concentrated power for such a prolonged period of time. Now, I don't think anyone would argue that, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, the first 2, 3, 4 months, people gave Governor Jay Inslee a lot of latitude to do what needed to be done. We had never dealt with a situation like this before. I think there were a lot of us who were like, I would not want to be in Governor Jay Inslee's shoes trying to make decisions. But as the state of emergency wore on, there became some real questions about not only the decisions that Governor Jay Inslee was making, decisions that were putting people out of work, that were costing people their livelihoods, but also questions about why Governor Jay Inslee wouldn't want to consult leaders in the legislature, wouldn't want to consult our representatives and our senators about the best path forward. I have been a vocal proponent of reforming our state's emergency powers. And for me, it was never really about whether Governor Jay Inslee was making good decisions or bad decisions during the pandemic. It was about the necessity for politicians to work together during one of the most critical crises that we've ever faced. You know, we send senators and representatives to Olympia for a reason. These are our directly elected representatives. They know their communities better than anyone else. Not to mention that the vast majority of state lawmakers have jobs and lives outside of politics. They are business owners, they are parents, they are educators, they are firefighters and police officers and caretakers. All I ever wanted was for Governor Jay Inslee to see them as a resource rather than an obstacle, rather than to act as if he was the only one who could make decisions.
There's only one person in the state of Washington who has the capability to save those lives right now, and it happens to be the governor of the state of Washington.
I've said before that leadership, true leadership, is about who you can bring to the table, not who you can keep away from it. Yet for 975 days, Governor Jay Inslee has opted to sit at a table alone, rather than look at his political opponents and even members of his own party as a resource to better serve the state. So this legislative session, I hope state lawmakers will not only stand up for themselves, but stand up for their constituents and put safeguards in place in case a future governor is just as selfish as the current one. Because the only thing that should matter is getting the best outcomes for the people you serve. And the only way to do that is by working together. The preceding segment was brought to you in partnership with Future 42. Turn your frustration into action at future42.org. I wanted to end the show today with some of your thoughts on the fact that Real Clear Politics now says that Tiffany Smiley and Patty Murray are in a virtual tie for the U.S. Senate seat in Washington State. Some mixed reaction. It's always funny when I go to Twitter, like the reactions are obviously much more from the left than on Facebook. Some folks on Twitter, baloney, saying they don't believe it. Judith, I live here. I'm not surprised, but I'll be very unhappy if that comes true. Let's see, some from Facebook. The Libertarian Party of Washington commented saying, we do not endorse either candidate. That said, here is something to think about. Patty Murray has been in office since 1992. You do not have to love her opponent to help end the reign of a 30-year career politician. Karen says term limits are needed. I've heard a lot of that sentiment as Tiffany Smiley has focused on the fact that Patty Murray has been in office for 30 years. And I think that's an effective kind of campaign message from her. Let's see. Stephen says, don't let it be a close race. Get out and vote. Remember what they did to Dino. Everybody refers to Dino Rossi's race for governor, where he won and then didn't win, and then won and then didn't win. That was at the beginning of mail-in voting, though. Come on, it was a little bit different. Let's see. Bill says, we need winners, not whiners. Call your friends and family and get them to vote for Smiley. Look, regardless of who you decide to vote for, just get your ballot in, and sooner rather than later. We're going to have Jason Rantz on the show later this week because he had a message for Republican voters about the fact that, there's this wing of the party that says, wait till the very last minute because then Democrats can't mess with your ballot. And even Jason Rantz says, that's ridiculous. And the longer you wait and you haven't turned your ballot in, then the candidates you support, they're going to spend time and money trying to reach you in the last days of the campaign. So if you're already made up your mind, get your ballot in, put it in a drop box before November 8th or before 8 p.m. on November 8th. Or if you're going to send it U.S. mail, you can technically have it postmarked on November 8th, but just make sure that if you're dropping it in a USPS mailbox, that it's actually going to be picked up. Or that day and postmark that day. So you don't want to risk it. But like I said, either way, just get your ballots in and vote. It's a really important election, so much at stake. And we've been talking about all of those things. So vote, 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 vote. All right, that's it for today's episode of Undivided. Thank you for being here. Thank you for your continuing commitment to give common sense a comeback. If you have not become a subscriber already, please do so. You can support our growth, support this mission for as little as $5 a month at patreon.com/undivided, or you can become a contributor on my locals community, brandikruse.locals.com. Thank you to the founding sponsor of Undivided, 1530 Mortgage. Visit them at 1530mortgage.com.